Oh, hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Chapter 10. Betsy has a birthday. Betsy's birthday was the 9th day of September, and the Necron-Set Valley Fair is always held from the 8th to the 12th. So it was decided that Betsy should celebrate her birthday by going up to Woodford, where the fair was held. The Putneys weren't going that year, but the people on the next farm, the Wendells, said they could make room in their surrey for the two little girls, for, of course, Molly was going too. In fact, she said the fair was held partly to celebrate her being 6 years old. This would happen on the 17th of October. Molly insisted that that was plenty close enough to the 9th of September to be celebrated then. This made Betsy feel like laughing out, but observing that the Putneys only looked at each other with the faintest possible quirk in the corners of their serious mouths, she understood that they were afraid that Molly's feelings might be hurt if they laughed out loud. So Betsy tried to curve her young lips to the same kind and secret mirth. And I can't tell you why this effort not to hurt Molly's feelings made her have a perfect spasm of love for Molly. She threw herself on her and gave her a great hug that tipped them both over on the couch on top of Shep, who stopped snoring with his great gurgling snort, wriggled out from under them, and stood with laughing eyes and wagging tail, looking at them as they rolled and giggled among the pillars. "What dress are you going to wear to the fair, Betsy?" asked Cousin Ann. "And we must decide about Molly's, too." This stopped their rough and tumble fun in short order, and they applied themselves to the serious question of a toilet. When the great day arrived and the surrey drove away from the Wendells' gate, Betsy was in a fresh pink and white gingham, which she had helped Cousin Ann make, and plump Molly looked like something good to eat in a crisp, white little dimity, one of Betsy's old dresses, with a deep hem taken in to make it short enough for the little butterball. Because it was Betsy's birthday, she sat on the front seat with Mr. Wendell, and part of that time, when there were not too many teams on the road, she drove herself. Mrs. Wendell and her sister filled the back seat solidly full from side to side, and made one continuous soft lap on which Molly happily perched, her shining eyes, her round cheeks red with joyful excitement. Betsy looked back at her several times and thought how very nice Molly looked. She had, of course, little idea how she herself looked, because the mirrors at Putney Farm were all small and high up. And anyhow, they were so old and greenish that they made everybody look very queer colored. You looked in them to see if your hair was smooth, and that was about all you could stand. So it was a great surprise to Betsy later in the morning as she and Molly wandered hand in hand through the wonders of Industrial Hall to catch sight of Molly in a full-length mirror as clear as water. She was almost startled to see how faithfully reflected were the yellow of the little girl's curls, the clear pink and white of her face, and the blue of her soft eyes. An older girl was reflected there also near Molly, a dark-eyed, red-cheeked, sturdy little girl standing very straight on two strong legs, holding her head high and free. her dark eyes looking out brightly from her tanned face. For an instant, Betsy gazed into those clear eyes, and then, why, gracious goodness, that was herself she was looking at. How changed she was. How very, very different she looked from the last time she had seen herself in a big mirror. She remembered it well, out shopping with Aunt Frances in a department store. She had caught sight of a pale little girl with a thin neck and spindling legs half hidden in the folds of Aunt Frances's skirts. But she didn't look even like the sister of this brown, muscular, upstanding child who held Molly's hand so firmly. All this came into her mind and went out again in a moment, for Molly caught sight of a big doll in the next aisle, and they hurried over to inspect her clothing. The mirror was forgotten in the many exciting sights and sounds and smells of their first country fair. The two little girls were to wander about as they pleased until noon, when they were to meet the Wendells in the shadow of Industrial Hall and eat their picnic lunch together. The two parties arrived together from different directions, having seen very different sides of the fair. The children were full of the merry-go-rounds, the balloon seller, the toy vendors, and the popcorn stands, while the Wendells exchanged views on the shortness of a hog's leg, the dip in a cow's back, and the thickness of a sheep's wool. The Wendells, it seemed, had met some cousins they didn't expect to see, who, not knowing about Betsy and Molly, had hoped that they might ride home with the Wendells. "Don't you suppose," Mrs. Wendell asked Betsy, "that you and Molly could go home with the Vogans? They're here in their big wagon. You could sit on the floor with the Vaughan children." Betsy and Molly thought this would be great fun and agreed enthusiastically. "All right then," said Mrs. Wendell. She called to a young man who stood inside the building near an open window. "Oh, Frank, Will Vaughan is going to be in your booth this afternoon, isn't he?" "Yes, ma'am," said the young man. "His turn is from 2 to 4. "Well, you tell him, will you, that the two little girls who live at Putney Farm are going to go home with them. They can sit on the bottom of the wagon with the Vaughan young ones." "Yes, ma'am," said the young man, with a noticeable lack of interest in how Betsy and Molly got home. "Now, Betsy," said Mrs. Wendell, "you go round to that booth at 2 and ask Will Vaughan what time they're going to start and where their wagon is, and then you be sure not to keep them waiting a minute." "No, I won't," said Betsy. "I'll be sure to be there on time." She and Molly still had 20 cents to spend out of the 40 they had brought with them, 25 earned by berry picking, and 15 a present from Uncle Henry. They now put their heads together to see how they could make the best possible use of their 4 nickels. Cousin Ann had put no restrictions whatever on them, saying they could buy any sort of truck or rubbish they could find, except the pink lemonade. She said she had been told the vendors washed their glasses in that, and their hands, and for all she knew, their faces. Betsy was for merry-go-rounds, but Molly yearned for a big red balloon. And while they were buying that, a man came by with toy dogs, little brown dogs with curled white tails. He called out that they would bark when you pulled the tails, and seeing the little girls looking at him, he pulled the tail of the one he held. It gave forth a fine, loud yelp, just like Shep when his tail got stepped on. Betsy bought one, all done up neatly in a box tied with blue string. She thought it a great bargain to get a dog who would bark for 5 cents. Later on, when they undid the string and opened the box, they found the dog had one leg broken off and wouldn't make the faintest squeak when his tail was pulled. But that is the sort of thing you must expect to have happen to you at a county fair. Now, they had 10 cents left, and they decided to have a ride apiece on the merry-go-round. But glancing up at the clock face in the tower over Agricultural Hall, Betsy noticed it was 2:30, and she decided to go first to the booth where Will Vaughan was to be, to find out what time they would start for home. She found the booth with no difficulty, but William Vaughan was not in it, nor was the young man she had seen before. There was a new one, a strange one, a careless, whistling young man with very bright socks, very yellow shoes, and very striped cuffs. He said in answer to Betsy's inquiry, "Vaughan? Will Vaughan? Never heard the name," and immediately went on whistling and looking up and down the aisle over the heads of the little girls, who stood gazing up at him with very wide, startled eyes. An older man leaned over from the next booth and said, "Will Vaughan? He from Hillsboro? Well, I heard somebody say those Hillsboro Vaughans had word one of their cows was awfully sick, and they had to start right home that minute." Betsy came to herself out of her momentary daze and snatched Molly's hand. "Hurry, quick, we must find the Wendells before they get away." In her agitation, for she was really very much frightened, she forgot how easily terrified little Molly was. Her alarm instantly set the child into a panic. "Oh, Betsy, Betsy, what will we do?" she gasped, as Betsy pulled her along the aisle and out of the door. "Oh, the Wendells can't be gone yet," said Betsy reassuringly, though she was not at all sure she was telling the truth. She ran as fast as she could drag Molly's fat legs to the horse shed where Mr. Wendell had tied his horses and left the surrey. The horse shed was empty, quite empty. Betsy stopped short and stood still, her heart seeming to be up in her throat so that she could hardly breathe. After all, she was only 10 that day, you must remember. Molly began to cry loudly, hiding her weeping face in Betsy's dress. "What will we do, Betsy? What can we do?" she wailed. Betsy did not answer. She did not know what they would do. They were 8 miles from Putney Farm, far too much for Molly to walk, and anyhow neither of them knew the way. They had only 10 cents left and nothing to eat, and the only people they knew in all that throng of strangers had gone back to Hillsboro. "What will we do, Betsy?" Molly kept on crying out, horrified by Betsy's silence and evident consternation. The other child's head swam. She tried again the formula which had helped her when Molly fell into the wolf pit, and asked herself desperately, what would Cousin Ann do if she were here? But that did not help her much now, because she could not possibly imagine what Cousin Ann would do under such appalling circumstances. Yes, one thing Cousin Ann would be sure to do, of course. She would quiet Molly first of all. At this thought, Betsy sat down on the ground and took the panic-stricken little girl into her lap, wiping away the tears and saying stoutly, "Now, Molly, stop crying this minute. I'll take care of you, of course. I'll get you home all right." "How will you ever do it?" sobbed Molly. "Everybody's gone and left us. We can't walk." "Never you mind how," said Betsy, trying to be facetious and mock mysterious. Oh my God. "Never you mind how," said Betsy, trying to be facetious and mock mysterious. though her own underlip was quivering a little. "That's my surprise party for you. Just you wait. Now come on back to that booth. Maybe Will Vaughn didn't go home with his folks." She had very little hope of this, and only went back there because it seemed to her a little less dauntingly strange than every other spot in the howling wilderness about her. For all at once the fair, which had seemed so lively and cheerful and gay before, seemed now a horrible, frightening, noisy place, full of hurried strangers who came and went their own ways, with not a glance out of their hard eyes for two little girls stranded far from home. The bright-colored young man was no better when they found him again. He stopped his whistling only long enough to say, "Nope, no Will Vaughan anywhere around these diggings yet." "We were going home with the Vaughans," murmured Betsy in a low tone, hoping for some help from him. "Looks as though you'd better go home on the cars," advised the young man casually. He smoothed his black hair straighter than ever from his forehead and looked over their heads. "How much does it cost to go to Hillsboro on the cars?" asked Betsy with a sinking heart. "You'll have to ask somebody else about that," said the young man. "What I don't know about this Rube state, I never was in it before." He spoke as though he were very proud of the fact. Betsy turned and went over to the older man who had told him about the Vaughans. Molly trotted at her heels, quite comforted, now that Betsy was talking so competently to grown-ups. She did not hear what they said, nor tried to. Now that Betsy's voice sounded all right, she had no more fears. Betsy would manage somehow. She heard Betsy's voice again, talking to the other man, but she was busy looking at an exhibit of beautiful jelly glasses, and paid no attention. Then Betsy led her away again out of doors, where everybody was walking back and forth under the bright September sky, blowing on horns, waving plumes of brilliant tissue paper, tickling each other with peacock feathers, and eating popcorn and candy out of paper bags. That reminded Molly that they had 10 cents yet. "Oh, Betsy," she proposed, "let's take a nickel of our money for some popcorn." She was startled by Betsy's fierce sudden clutch at their little purse and by the quaver in her voice as she answered, No, Molly, we've got to save every cent of that. I found out it cost 30 cents for us both to go home to Hillsboro on the train. The last one goes at 6 o'clock. But we haven't got but 10, said Molly. Betsy looked at her silently for a moment and then burst out, I'll earn the rest. I'll earn it somehow. I'll have to. There isn't any other way. All right, said Molly quaintly, not seeing anything unusual in this. You can if you want to. I'll wait for you here. No, you won't, cried Betsy, who had quite enough of trying to meet people in a crowd. No, you won't. You just follow me every minute. I don't want you out of my sight. They began to move forward now, Betsy's eyes widely roving from one place to another. How could a little girl earn money at a county fair? She was horribly afraid to go up and speak to a stranger, and yet how else could she begin? Here, Molly, you wait here, she said. Don't you budge till I come back. But alas, Molly had only a moment to wait that time, for the man who was selling lemonade answered Betsy's shy question with a stare and a curt, Lord, no, what could a young one like you do for me? The little girls wandered on, Molly calm and expectant, confident in Betsy. Betsy, with a very dry mouth and a very gone feeling. They were passing by a big shed-like building now. Where a large sign proclaimed that the Woodford Ladies' Aid Society would serve a hot chicken dinner for 35 cents. Of course, the sign was not accurate, for at 3:30, almost 4, the chicken dinner had long ago been all eaten, and in place of the diners was a group of weary women moving languidly about or standing saggingly by a great table piled with dirty dishes. Betsy paused here, meditated for a moment, and went in rapidly so that her courage would not evaporate. The woman with gray hair looked down at her a little impatiently and said, "Dinner's all over." "I didn't come for dinner," said Betsy, swallowing hard. "I came to see if you wouldn't hire me to wash your dishes. I'll do them for 25 cents. The woman laughed, looked from little Betsy to the great pile of dishes and said, turning away, "Mercy, child, if you washed from now till morning, you wouldn't make a hole in what we've got to do." Betsy heard her say to the other woman, "Some young one wanting more money for the sideshows." Now was the moment to remember what Cousin Ann would have done. She would certainly not have shaken all over with hurt feelings, nor have allowed the tears to come stingingly to her eyes. So Betsy sternly made herself stop doing these things. And Cousin Ann wouldn't have given way to the dreadful sinking feeling of utter discouragement, but would have gone right on to the next place. So although Betsy felt like nothing so much as crooking her elbow over her face, and crying as hard as she could cry, she stiffened her back, took Molly's hand again and stepped out, heartsick within, but very steady, although rather pale, without. She and Molly walked along in the crowd again, Molly laughing and pointing out the pranks and antics of the young people who were feeling livelier than ever as the afternoon wore on. Betsy looked at them grimly with unseeing eyes. It was 4 o'clock. The last train of Hillsborough left in 2 hours, and she was no nearer having the price of the tickets. She stopped for a moment to get her breath, for although they were walking slowly, she kept feeling breathless and choked. It occurred to her that if ever a little girl had a more horrible birthday, she never heard of one. "Oh, I wish I could, Dan," said a young voice near her. "But honest, Mama just eat me up alive if I left the booth for a minute." Betsy turned quickly. A very pretty girl with yellow hair and blue eyes, she looked as Molly might when she was grown up, was leaning over the edge of a little canvas-colored booth, the sign of which announced that homemade donuts and soft drinks were for sale there. A young man, very flushed and gay, was pulling at the girl's blue gingham sleeve. "Oh, come on, Annie, just one turn. The floor's elegant. You can keep an eye on the booth from the hall. Nobody's going to run away with the old thing anyhow." "Honest, I'd love to, but I got a great lot of dishes to wash too. You know your mama." She looked longingly toward the open-air dancing floor, out from which just then floated a burst of brazen music. "Oh, please," said a small voice. "I'll do it for 20 cents. Betsy stood by the girl's elbow, all quivering earnestly. "Do what, kitty?" asked the girl in a good-natured surprise. "Everything," said Betsy compendiously. "Everything. Wash the dishes, tend the booth, and you can go dance. I'll do it for 20 cents. The eyes of the girl and the man met in high amusement. "My, aren't we up and coming?" said the man. "You're most as big as a pint cup, aren't you?" he said to Betsy. The little girl flushed. She detested being laughed at, but she looked straight into the laughing eyes. "I'm 10 years old today," she said, "and I can wash dishes as well as anybody." She spoke with dignity. The young man burst out into a great laugh. "Great, kid, what?" he said to the girl, and then, "Say, Annie, why not? Your mother won't be here for an hour. The kid can keep folks from walking off with the dope and..." "I'll do the dishes too," repeated Betsy, trying hard not to mind being laughed at and keeping her eyes fixed steadily on the tickets to Hillsboro. Well, by gosh, said the young man, laughing. Here's our chance, Annie, for fair. Come along. The girl laughed too, out of high spirits. Wouldn't Mama be crazy? She said hilariously. But she'll never know. Here, you cute kid, here's my apron. She took off her long apron and tied it around Betsy's neck. There's the soap, there's the table. You stack the dishes up on that counter. She was out of the little gate in the counter in a twinkling, just as Molly, in answer to a beckoning gesture from Betsy, came in. Hello, there's another one, said the gay young man, gayer and gayer. Hello, Button. What are you going to do? I suppose when they try to crack the safe, you'll run at them and bark and drive them away. Molly opened her sweet blue eyes very wide, not understanding a single word. The girl laughed, swooped back, gave Molly a kiss, and disappeared, running side by side with the young man toward the dance hall. Betsy mounted on a soapbox and began joyfully to wash the dishes. She had never thought that ever in her life would she simply love to wash dishes beyond anything else. But it was so. Her relief was so great that she could have kissed the coals, thick plates and glasses as she washed them. It's all right, Molly. It's all right, she quavered exultantly to Molly over her shoulder. But as Molly had not, from the moment Betsy took command, suspected that it was not all right, she only nodded and asked if she might sit up on a barrel where she could watch the crowd go by. I guess you could. I don't know why not, said Betsy doubtfully. She lifted her up and went back to her dishes. Never were dishes washed better. 2 donuts, please, said a man's voice behind her. Oh, mercy, there was somebody come to buy. Whatever should she do? She came forward intending to say that the owner of the booth was away and she didn't know anything about it. But the man laid down a nickel, took 2 donuts, and turned away. Betsy gasped and looked at the homemade sign stuck into the big pan of donuts. Sure enough, it read 2 for $5. She put the nickel up on the shelf and went back to her dishwashing. Selling things wasn't so hard, she reflected. As her haunted feeling of depression relaxed, she began to find some fun in her new situation, and when a woman with 2 little boys approached, she came forward to wait on her, elated and important. 2 for $5, she said in a business-like tone. The woman put down a dime, took up 4 donuts, divided them between her sons, and departed. My, said Molly, looking admiringly at Betsy's coolness over this transaction. Betsy went back to her dishes, stepping high. Oh, Betsy, see! The pig! The ox! Cried Molly now, looking from her cone of vantage down the wide, grass-grown lane between the booths. Betsy craned her head around over her shoulder, continuing conscientiously to wash and wipe the dishes. The prize stock was being paraded around the fair. The great prize ox, his shining horns tipped with blue rosettes. The prize cows with wreaths around their necks. The prize horses, 4 or 5 of them as glossy as satin, curving their bright, strong necks and stepping as though on eggs. Their manes and tails braided with bright ribbon. And then, oh, Betsy, look at that pig, screamed Molly again. The smaller animals, the sheep, the calves, the colts, and the pig which waddled along with portly dignity. Betsy looked as well as she could over her shoulder. And in years to come, she can shut her eyes and see again in every detail that rustic procession under the golden September light. But she looked anxious at the clock. It was nearing 5. Oh, suppose the girl forgot and danced too long. 2 bottles of ginger ale and half a dozen donuts, said a man with a woman and 3 children. Betsy looked feverish, feverish among the bottles ranged on the counter, selected 2 mock ginger ale, and glared at their corrugated tin stoppers. "How did you get them open?" "Here's your opener," said the man, "if that's what you looking for. Here, you get the glasses and I'll open the bottles. We're in kind of a hurry. Got to catch a train." Well, they were not the only people who had to catch a train, Betsy thought sadly. They drank in gulps and departed, cramming donuts into their mouths. Betsy wished ardently that the girl would come back. She was now almost sure that she had forgotten and would dance there till nightfall. But there she came, running along as light-footed after an hour's dancing as when she had left the booth. "Here you are, kid," said the young man, producing a quarter. "We've had the time of our young lives, thanks to you." Betsy gave him back one of the nickels that remained to her, but he refused it. "No, keep the change," he said royally. "It was worth it." "Then I'll buy 2 donuts with my extra nickel," said Betsy. "No, you won't," said the girl. "You'll take all you want for nothing. Mama'll never miss 'em, and what you sell here has got to be fresh every day. Here, hold out your hands, both of you." "Some people came and bought things," said Betsy, happening to remember as she and Molly turned away. "The money is on that shelf." "Well now," said the girl, "if she didn't take hold and sell things. Say," she ran after Betsy and gave her a hug. "You smart young one. I wish I had a little sister just like you." Molly and Betsy hurried along out of the gate into the main street of the town and down to the station. Molly was eating donuts as she went. They were both quite hungry by this time, but Betsy could not think of eating till she had those tickets in her hand. She pushed her quarter and a nickel into the ticket seller's window and said, "Hillsboro," in as confident a tone as she could. But when the precious bits of paper were pushed out at her and she actually held them, her knees shook under her and she had to go and sit down on the bench. "My, aren't these donuts good?" said Molly. "I never in my life had enough donuts before." Betsy drew a long breath and began rather languidly to eat one herself. She felt all of a sudden very, very tired. She was tireder still when they got out of the train at Hillsboro Station and started warily up the road toward Putney Farm. 2 miles lay before them, 2 miles which they had often walked before, but never after such a day as now lay back of them. Molly dragged her feet as she walked and hung heavily on Betsy's hand. Betsy plodded along, her head hanging, her eyes all gritty with fatigue and sleepiness. A light buggy spun round the turn of the road behind them, the single horse trotting fast, as though the driver were in a hurry, the wheels rattling smartly on the hard road. The little girls drew out to one side and stood waiting till the road should be free again. When he saw them, the driver pulled the horse back so quickly it stood almost straight up. He peered at them through the twilight and then with a loud shout sprang over the side of the buggy. It was Uncle Henry. Oh, goody, it was Uncle Henry come to meet them. They wouldn't have to walk any further. But what was the matter with Uncle Henry? He ran up to them exclaiming, "Are ye all right? Are ye all right?" He stooped over and felt of them desperately as though he expected them to be broken somewhere, and Betsy could feel that his old hands were shaking, that he was trembling all over when she said, "Why, yes, Uncle Henry, we're all right. We came home in the cars." Uncle Henry leaned up against the fence as though he couldn't stand up. He took off his hat and wiped his forehead, and he said, it didn't seem as though it could be Uncle Henry talking. He sounded so excited. Well, by gosh, well, by thunder now. And so here ye are, and you're all right. Well, he couldn't seem to stop exclaiming, and you can't imagine anything stranger than an Uncle Henry who couldn't stop exclaiming. After they all got into the buggy, he quieted down a little and said, "Thunderation! But we've had a scare. When the Wendells come back with their cousins early this afternoon, they said you were coming with the Voghands. And then when you didn't come, we telephoned the Voghands, and they said they hadn't seen hide nor hair of ye, and didn't even know you were to the fair at all. I tell you, your Aunt Abigail and I had an awful turn. Ann and I hitched up quicker than scat, and she put right out with Prince, up toward Woodford, and I took Jessie down this way. Thought maybe I'd get trace of ye somewhere. Well, land. He wiped his forehead again. Wa'n't I glad to see you standing there? Get along, Jess. I want to get the news to Abigail as soon as I can. Now tell me, what in thunder did happen to you? Betsy began at the beginning and told straight through, interrupted at first by indignant comments from Uncle Henry, who was outraged by the Wendells' loose wearing of their responsibility for the children. But as she went on, he quieted down to a closely attentive silence, interrupting only to keep Jess at her top speed. Now that it was all safely over, Betsy thought her story quite an interesting one, and she omitted no detail, although she wondered once or twice if perhaps Uncle Henry were listening to her. He kept so still. And so I bought the tickets and we got home, she ended, adding, Oh, Uncle Henry, you ought to have seen the prize pig. He was too funny. They turned into the Putney yard now and saw Aunt Abigail's bulky form on the porch. Got him, Abby. All right, no harm done, shouted Uncle Henry. Aunt Abigail turned without a word and went back into the house. When the little girls dragged their weary legs in, they found her quietly setting out some supper for them on the table, but she was wiping away with her apron the joyful tears which ran down her cheeks. Such white cheeks. It seemed so strange to see rosy Aunt Abigail with a face like paper. Well, I'm glad to see ye, she told them soberly. Sit right down and have some hot milk. I had some already. The telephone rang. She went into the next room, and they heard her saying in an unsteady voice, All right, Ann, they're here. Your father just brought them in. I hadn't had time to hear about what happened yet, but they're all right. You better come home. That's your cousin Ann telephoning from the Marshalls. She herself went and sat down heavily. And when Uncle Henry came in a few minutes later, she asked him in a rather weak voice for the ammonia bottle. He rushed for it, got her a fan and a drink of cold water, and hung over her anxiously till the color began to come back into her pale face. I know just how you feel, Mother, he said sympathetically. When I saw him standing there by the roadside, I felt as though somebody had hit me a clip right in the pit of the stomach. The little girls ate their supper in a tired daze, not paying any attention to what the grown-ups were saying, until rapid hoofs clicked on the stones outside, and Cousin Ann came in quickly, her black eyes snapping. Now, for mercy's sake, tell me what happened, she said, adding hotly, and if I don't give that Maria Wendell a piece of my mind... Uncle Henry broke in. I'm going to tell what happened. I want to do it. You and Mother just listen. Just sit right down and listen. His voice was shaken with feeling, and as he went on and told of Betsy's afternoon, her fright, her confusion, her forming the plan of coming home on the train and of earning the money for the tickets, he made for once no Putney pretense of casual coolness. His eyes flashed fire as he talked. Betsy watched him, felt her heart swell and beat fast in incredulous joy. Why, he was so proud of her. She had done something to make the Putney cousins proud of her. When Uncle Henry came to the part where she went on asking for employment after one and then another refusal, Cousin Ann reached out her long arms and quickly, almost roughly, gathered Betsy up on her lap, holding her close as she listened. Betsy had never before sat on Cousin Ann's lap. And when Uncle Henry finished, he had not forgotten a single thing Betsy had told him, and asked, What do you think of that, For a little girl 10 years old today. Cousin Ann opened the floodgates wide and burst out. I think I never heard of a child's doing a smarter, grittier thing. And I don't care if she does hear me say so. It was a great, a momentous, an historic moment. Betsy, enthroned on those strong knees, wondered if any little girl had ever had such a beautiful birthday. Chapter 11. Understood Aunt Frances. About a month after Betsy's birthday, one October day when the leaves were all red and yellow, two very momentous events occurred. And in a manner of speaking, at the very same time. Betsy had noticed that her kitten Eleanor, she still thought of her as a kitten, although she was now a big grown-up cat, spent very little time around the house. She came into the kitchen 2 or 3 times a day, mewing loudly for milk and food, but after eating very fast, she always disappeared at once. Betsy missed the purring, contented ball of fur on her lap in the long evenings as she played checkers, or read aloud, or sewed, or played guessing games. She felt rather hurt, too, that Eleanor paid her so little attention, and several times she tried hard to make her stay, trailing in front of her a spool tied to a string, or rolling a worsted ball across the floor. But Eleanor seemed to have lost all her taste for the things she had liked so much. Invariably, the moment the door was opened, she darted out and vanished. One afternoon, Betsy ran out after her, determined to catch her and bring her back. When the cat found she was being followed, she bounded along in great leaps, constantly escaping from Betsy's outstretched hand. They came thus to the horse barn, into the open door of which Eleanor whisked, like a little gray shadow, Betsy close behind. The cat flashed up the steep ladder-like stairs that led to the hayloft. Betsy scrambled rapidly up too. It was dark up there compared to the gorgeous-colored October day outside, and for a moment she could not see Eleanor. Then she made her out, a dim little shape, picking her way over the hay, and she heard her talking. Yes, it was real talk, quite different from the loud, imperious meow with which Eleanor asked for her milk. This was the softest, prettiest kind of conversation, all little murmurs and chirps and sing-songs. Why, Betsy could almost understand it. She could understand it enough to know that it was love talk. And then, breaking into this, came a sudden series of shrill, little needle-like cries that fairly filled the hayloft. Eleanor gave a bound forward and disappeared. Betsy, very much excited, scrambled and climbed up over the hay as fast as she could go. It was all silent now. The piercing, funny little squalls had stopped as suddenly as they began. On the top, in a little nest, lay Eleanor, purring so loudly you could hear her all over the big mow, and so proud and happy she could hardly contain herself. Her eyes glistened. She arched her back, rolled over and spread out her paws, disclosing to Betsy's astounded, delighted eyes. No, she wasn't dreaming. 2 dear little kittens, one all gray just like its mother, one gray with a big bib on his chest. Oh, how dear they were, how darling and cuddly and fuzzy. Betsy put her fingers very softly on the gray one's head and thrilled to feel the warmth of the little living creature. "Oh, Eleanor," she asked eagerly, "can I pick one up?" She lifted the gray one gently and held it up to her cheek. The little thing nestled down in the warm hollow of her hand. She could feel its tiny, tiny little claws pricking softly into her palm. "Oh, you sweetness, you little baby thing," she said over and over in a whisper. Eleanor did not stop purring, and she looked up with friendly, trusting eyes as her little mistress made the acquaintance of her children. But Betsy could feel somehow that Eleanor was anxious about her kitten, was afraid that, although the little girl meant everything that was kind, her great, clumsy, awkward human hands weren't clever enough to hold a baby cat the proper way. "I don't blame you a bit, Eleanor," said Betsy. "I should feel just so in your place. There, I won't touch it again." She laid the kitten down carefully by its mother. Eleanor at once began to wash its face very vigorously, knocking it over and over with a strong tongue. "My," said Betsy, laughing. "You'd scratch my eyes out if I were as rough as that." Eleanor didn't seem to hear, or rather she seemed to hear something else, for she stopped short. Her head lifted, her ears pricked up, listening very hard to some distant sound. Then Betsy heard it too, somebody coming into the barn below. Little, quick, uneven footsteps. It must be little Molly tagging along as she always did. What fun to show Molly the kittens. "Betsy!" called Molly from below. "Molly!" called Betsy from above. "Come up here quick, I got something up here." There was a sound of scrambling, rapid feet on the rough stairs, and Molly's yellow curls appeared, shining in the dusk. "I've got a," she began, but Betsy did not let her finish. "Come here, Molly, quick, quick," she called, beckoning eagerly as though the kittens might evaporate into thin air if Molly didn't get there at once. Molly forgot what she was going to say, climbed madly up the steep pile of hay, and in a moment was lying flat on her stomach beside the little family in a spasm of delight that satisfied even Betsy and Eleanor. Both of them convinced that these were the finest kittens the world had ever seen. "See, there are two," said Betsy. "You can have one for your very own, and I'll let you choose. Which one do you like best?" She was hoping that Molly would not take the little all-gray one, because she had fallen in love with that the minute she saw it. "Oh, this one with the white on his breast," said Molly without a moment's hesitation. "It's lots the prettiest. Oh, Betsy, for my very own." Something white fell out of the folds of her skirt on the hay. "Oh, yes," she said indifferently. "A letter for you. Miss Ann told me to bring it out here. She said she saw you streaking it for the barn." It was a letter from Aunt Frances. Betsy opened it, one eye on Molly to see that she did not hug her new darling too tightly, and began to read it in the ray of dusty sunlight, slanting in through a crack in the side of the barn. She could do this easily because Aunt Frances always made her handwriting very large and round and clear, so that a little girl could read it without half trying. As she read, everything faded away from before her. The barn, Molly, the kittens. She saw nothing but the words on the page. When she had read the letter through, she got up quickly, oh, ever so quickly, and went away down the stairs. Molly hardly noticed she had gone, so absorbing and delightful were the kittens. Betsy went out of the dusky barn into the rich October splendor and saw none of it. She went straight away from the house and the barn, straight up into the hill pasture toward her favorite place beside the brook, the shady pool under the big maple tree. At first she walked, but after a while she ran, faster and faster, as though she could not get there soon enough. Her head was down, and one arm was crooked over her face. And do you know, I'm not going to follow her up there, nor let you go. I'm afraid we would all cry if we saw what Betsy did under the big maple tree. And the very reason she ran away so fast was so that she could be all by herself for a very hard hour and fight it out alone. So let us go back soberly to the orchard where the Putneys are and wait till Betsy comes walking listlessly in, her eyes red and her cheeks pale. Cousin Ann was up in the top of a tree. A basket hung over her shoulder, half full of striped red northern spies. Uncle Henry was on a ladder against another tree, filling a bag with the beautiful, shining yellow-green pound sweets. And Aunt Abigail was moving around, picking up the party-colored windfalls and putting them into barrels ready to go to the cider mill. Something about the way Betsy walked, and as she drew closer, something about the expression of her face, and as she began to speak, something about the tone of her voice stopped all this cheerful activity as though a bomb had gone off in their midst. "I've had a letter from Aunt Frances," said Betsy, biting her lips, "and she says she's coming to take me away, back to them tomorrow." There was a big silence. Cousin Ann stood perfectly motionless up in her tree, staring down through the leaves at Betsy. Uncle Henry was turned around on his ladder, one hand on an apple as though it had frozen there, staring down at Betsy. Aunt Abigail leaned with both fat hands on her barrel, staring hard at Betsy. Betsy was staring down at her shoes, biting her lips and winking her eyes. The yellow, hazy October sun sank slowly down toward the rim of Hemlock Mountain and sent along golden shafts of light through the branches of the trees upon this group of people, all so silent, so motionless. Betsy was the first to speak, and I'm very proud of her for what she said. She said loyally, "Dear Aunt Frances, she was always so sweet to me. She always tried so hard to take care of me." For that was what Betsy had found up by the brook under the big red maple tree. She had found there a certainty that, whatever else she did, she must not hurt Aunt Frances's feelings, dear, gentle, sweet Aunt Frances, whose feelings were so easily hurt, and who had given her so many years of such anxious care. Something up there had told her, perhaps the quiet blue shadow of a windward mountain creeping slowly over the pasture toward her, perhaps the silent glory of the great red and gold tree, perhaps the singing murmur of the little brook, perhaps all of them together had told her that now had come a time when she must do more than what Cousin Ann would do, when she must do what she herself knew was right, and that was to protect Aunt Frances from her. When she spoke, out there in the orchard, she broke the spell of silence. Cousin Ann climbed hastily down from her tree with her basket only partly filled. Uncle Henry got stiffly over his ladder, and Aunt Abigail advanced through the grass. And they all said the same thing. "Let me see that letter." They read it there, looking over each other's shoulders with grave faces. Then, still silently, they all turned and went back into the house, leaving their forgotten bags and barrels and baskets out under the trees. when they found themselves in the kitchen. "Well, it's supper time anyhow," said Cousin Ann hastily, as if ashamed of losing her composure. "Or almost time. We might as well get to it now. We might as well get it now." "I'm going out to milk," said Uncle Henry gruffly, although it was not nearly his usual time. He took up the milk pails and marched out toward the barn, stepping heavily, his head hanging. Shep woke up with a snort, and getting off the couch, gambooled clumsily up to Betsy, wagging his tail and jumping up on her, ready for a frolic. That was almost too much for Betsy. To think that after tomorrow she would never see Shep again. No Eleanor, no the kittens. She choked as she bent over Shep and put her arms around his neck for a great hug. But she mustn't cry. She mustn't hurt Aunt Frances's feelings or show that she wasn't glad to go back to her. That wouldn't be fair after all Aunt Frances had done for her. That night she lay awake after she and Molly had gone to bed, and Molly was asleep. They had decided not to tell Molly until the last minute, so she had dropped off peacefully as usual. But poor Betsy's eyes were wide open. She saw a gleam of light under the door. It widened. The door opened. Aunt Abigail stood there in her nightcap, mountainous in her long white gown, a candle shining up into her serious old face. "You awake, Betsy?" she whispered, seeing the child's dark eyes gleaming at her over the covers. I just thought I'd look in to see if you were all right." She came to the edge of the bed and set the candle down on the little stand. Betsy reached her arms up longingly, and the old woman stooped over her. Neither of them said a single word during the long embrace which followed. Then Aunt Abigail straightened up hastily, took her candle very quickly and softly, and heavily padded out of the room. Betsy turned over and flung one arm over Molly. No Molly either, after tomorrow. She gulped hard and stared up at the ceiling, dimly white in the starlight. A gleam of light shone under the door. It widened, and Uncle Henry stood there, a candle in his hand, peering into the room. "You awake, Betsy?" he said cautiously. "Yes, I'm awake, Uncle Henry." The old man shuffled into the room. "I just got to thinking," he said, hesitating, "that maybe you'd like to take my watch with you. It's kind of handy to have a watch on the train, and I'd like real well for you to have it." He laid it down on the stand, his own cherished gold watch that had been given him when he was 21. Betsy reached out and took his hard, gnarled old fist in a tight grip. "Oh, Uncle Henry," she began, and could not go on. "We'll miss you, Betsy," he said in an uncertain voice. It's been real nice to have you here." And then he too snatched up his candle very quickly and almost ran out of the room. Betsy turned over on her back. "No crying now," she told herself fiercely. "No crying now." She clenched her hands tightly together. Tightly and set her teeth. Something moved in the room. Somebody leaned over her. It was Cousin Ann, who didn't make a sound, not one, but who took Betsy in her strong arms and held her close and closer till Betsy could feel the quick pulse of the other's heart beating all through her own body. Then she was gone, as silently as she came. But somehow that great embrace had taken away all the burning tightness from Betsy's eyes and heart. She was very, very tired, and soon after this she fell sound asleep, snuggled up close to Molly. In the morning, nobody spoke of last night at all. Breakfast was prepared and eaten, and the team hitched up directly afterward. Betsy and Uncle Henry were to drive to the station together to meet Aunt Frances's train. Betsy put on her new wine-colored cashmere that Cousin Anne had made her, with the soft white collar of delicate old embroidery that Aunt Abigail had given her out of one of the trunks in the attic. She and Uncle Henry said very little as they drove to the village, and even less as they stood waiting together on the platform. Betsy slipped her hand into his, and he held it tight as the train whistled in the distance and came slowly and laboriously puffing up to the station. Just one person got off at the little station, and that was Aunt Frances, looking ever so dressed up and citified. With a fluffy ostrich feather boa and kid gloves and a white veil over her face and a big blue one floating from her gay flowered velvet hat. How pretty she was, and how young under the veil which hid so kindly all the little lines in her sweet thin face. And how excited and fluttery. Betsy had forgotten how fluttery Aunt Frances was. She clasped Betsy to her and then started back crying she must see to her suitcase. And then she clasped Betsy to her again and shook hands with Uncle Henry, whose grim old face looked about as cordial and welcoming as the sourest kind of sour pickle, and she fluttered back and said she must have left her umbrella on the train. "Oh, conductor, my umbrella, right in my seat, a blue one with a crooked over, oh, here it is in my hand, what am I thinking of?" The conductor evidently thought he'd better get the train away as soon as possible, for he now shouted, "All aboard!" to nobody at all and sprang back on the steps. The train went off, groaning over the steep grade and screaming out its usual echoing warning about the next road crossing. Uncle Henry took Aunt Frances's suitcase and plodded back to the surrey. He got into the front seat, and Aunt Frances and Betsy in the back, and they started off. And now I want you to listen to every single word that was said on the back seat, for it was a very, very important conversation when Betsy's fate hung on the curl of an eyelash and the flicker of a voice, as fates often do. Aunt Frances hugged Betsy again and exclaimed about her having grown so big and tall and fat. She didn't say brown too, although you could see that she was thinking that, as she looked through her veil at Betsy's tanned face and down at the contrast between her own pretty white fingers and Betsy's leather-colored muscular little hands. She exclaimed and kept on exclaiming. Betsy wondered if she really always had been as fluttery as this, and then all of a sudden it came out, the great news, the reason for the extra flutteriness. Aunt Frances was going to be married. Yes, think of it. Betsy fell back open-mouthed with astonishment. Did Betsy think her Aunt Frances a silly old thing? "Oh, Aunt Frances, no," cried Betsy fervently. "You look just as young and pretty, lots younger than I remembered you." Aunt Frances flushed with pleasure and went on. "You'll love your old Aunt Frances just as much, won't you, when she's Mrs. Plimpton?" Betsy put her arms around her and gave her a great hug. "I'll always love you, Aunt Frances," she said. "You'll love Mr. Plimpton, too. He's so big and strong, and he just loves to take care of people. He says that's why he's marrying me. Don't you wonder where we are going to live?" she asked, answering her own question quickly. "We're not going to live anywhere. Isn't that a joke? Mr. Plimpton's business keeps him always moving around from one place to another, never more than a month anywhere." "What'll Aunt Harriet do?" asked Betsy wonderingly. "Why, she's ever and ever so much better," said Aunt Frances happily. "And her own sister, my Aunt Rachel, has come back from China, where she's been a missionary for ever so long. And the two old ladies are going to keep house together out in California in the dearest little bungalow, all roses and honeysuckle. But you're going to be with me. Won't it be jolly fun, darling, to go traveling all about everywhere and see new places all the time?" Now those are the words Aunt Frances said, but something in her voice and her face suggested a faint possibility to Betsy that maybe Aunt Frances didn't really think it would be such awfully jolly fun as her words said. Her heart gave a big jump up, and she had to hold tight to the arm of the surrey before she could ask in a quiet voice, "But Aunt Frances, won't I be awfully in your way, traveling around so?" Now Aunt Frances had ears of her own, and though that was what Betsy's words said, what Aunt Frances heard was a suggestion that possibly Betsy wasn't as crazy to leave Putney Farm as she had supposed, of course, she would be. They both stopped talking for a moment and peered at each other through the thicket of words that held them apart. "I told you this was a very momentous conversation. One sure thing is that the people on the back seat saw the inside of the surrey as they traveled along, and nothing else. Red sumac and bronze beech trees waved their flags at them in vain. They kept their eyes fixed on each other intently, each in an agony of fear lest she hurt the other's feelings." After a pause, Aunt Frances came to herself with a start and said, affectionately putting her arm around Betsy, "Why, you darling, what does Aunt Frances care about trouble if her own dear baby girl is happy?" And Betsy said resolutely, "Oh, you know, Aunt Frances, I'd love to be with you." She ventured one more step through the thicket. "But honestly, Aunt Frances, won't it be a bother?" But Aunt Frances ventured another step to meet her. "But dear little girls must be somewhere." And Betsy almost forgot her caution and burst out, "But I could stay here. I know they would keep me." Even Aunt Frances's two veils could not hide the gleam of relief and hope that came into her pretty thin, sweet face. She summoned all her courage and stepped out into the clearing in the middle of the thicket, asking right out boldly, "Why, do you like it here, Betsy? Would you like to stay?" And Betsy, she never could remember afterward if she had been careful enough not to shout too loudly and joyfully. Betsy cried out, "Oh, I love it here!" And there they stood face to face, looking at each other with honest and very happy eyes. Aunt Frances threw her arm around Betsy and asked again, "Are you sure, dear?" And didn't try to hide her relief, and neither did Betsy. "I could visit you once in a while when you are somewhere near here," suggested Betsy, beaming. "Oh, yes, I must have some of the time with my darling," said Aunt Frances, and this time there was nothing in their hearts that contradicted their lips. They clung to each other in speechless satisfaction as Uncle Henry guided the surrey up to the marble stepping stone. Betsy jumped out first, and while Uncle Henry was helping Aunt Frances out, she was dashing up the walk like a crazy thing. She flung open the front door and catapulted into Aunt Abigail just coming out. It was like flinging herself into a feather bed. Oh, she gasped out. "Aunt Frances is going to be married and travel around all the time, and she doesn't really want me at all. Can I stay here? Can I stay here?" Cousin Ann was right behind Aunt Abigail, and she heard this. She looked over their shoulders toward Aunt Frances, who was approaching from behind, and said in her usual calm and collected voice, "How do you do, Frances? Glad to see you, Frances. How well you looking. I hear you are in for congratulations. Who's the happy man?" Betsy was overcome with admiration for her coolness in being able to talk so in such an exciting moment. She knew Aunt Abigail couldn't have done it for she had sat down in a rocking chair and was holding Betsy on her lap. The little girl could see her wrinkled old hand trembling on the arm of the chair. "I hope that means," continued Cousin Anne, going as usual straight to the point, "that we can keep Betsy here with us." "Oh, would you like to?" asked Aunt Frances, fluttering as though the idea had never occurred to her before that minute. Would Elizabeth Ann really like to stay? "Oh, I'd like to, all right," said Betsy, looking confidently up into Aunt Abigail's face. Aunt Abigail spoke now. She cleared her throat twice before she could bring out a word. Then she said, "Why, yes, we'd kinda like to keep her. We've sort of got used to having her around." That's what she said. But as you have noticed before on this exciting day, what people said didn't matter as much as what they looked. And as her old lips pronounced these words so quietly, the corners of Aunt Abigail's mouth were twitching, and she was swallowing hard. She said impatiently to Cousin Anne, "Hand me that handkerchief, Anne." And as she blew her nose, she said, "Oh, what an old fool I am." Then all of a sudden, it was as though a great fresh breeze had blown through the house. They all drew a long breath and began to talk loudly and cheerfully about the weather and Aunt Frances's trip and how Aunt Harriet was and which room Aunt Frances was to have and would she leave her wraps down in the hall or take them upstairs. And in the midst of this, Betsy, her heart ready to burst, dashed out of doors, followed by Shep. She ran madly toward the barn. She did not know where she was going. She only knew that she must run and jump and shout, or she would explode. Shep ran and jumped because Betsy did. To these two wild creatures careering through the air like bright blown autumn leaves appeared little Molly in the barn door. "Oh, I'm going to stay! I'm going to stay!" screamed Betsy. But as Molly had not had any notion of the contrary, she only said, "Of course, why not?" and went on to something really important, saying in a very much capitalized statement, "My kitten can walk. It took 3 steps just now." After Aunt Frances got her wraps off, Betsy took her for a tour of inspection. They went all over the house first, with special emphasis laid on the living room. "Isn't this the loveliest place?" said Betsy fervently, looking about her at the white curtains, the bright flowers, the southern sunshine, the bookcases, and the bright cooking utensils. It was all full to the brim to her eyes with happiness, and she forgot entirely that she had thought it a very poor, common kind of room when she had first seen it. Nor did she notice that Aunt Frances showed no enthusiasm over it now. She stopped for a few moments to wash some potatoes and put them into the oven for dinner. Aunt Frances opened her eyes at this. "I always see to the potatoes and the apples, and the cooking of them, I mean," explained Betsy proudly. "I've just learned to make apple pie and brown Betty." Then down into the stone-floored milk room where Aunt Abigail was working over butter and where Betsy, swelling with pride, showed Aunt Frances how deftly and smoothly she could manipulate the wooden paddle and make rolls of butter that weighed within an ounce or 2 of a pound. "Mercy, child, think of your being able to do such things," said Aunt Frances, more and more astonished. They went out of doors now, Shep bounding by their side. Betsy was amazed to see that Aunt Frances drew back, quite nervously, whenever the big dog frisked near her. Out in the barn, Betsy had a disappointment. Aunt Frances just balked absolutely at those ladder-like stairs. "Oh, I couldn't, dear. Do you go up there? Is it quite safe?" "Why, Aunt Abigail went up there to see the kittens," cried Betsy on the edge of exasperation. but her heart softened at the sight of Aunt Frances's evident distress of mind at the very idea of climbing into the loft, and she brought the kittens down for inspection, Eleanor mewing anxiously at the top of the stairs. On the way back to the house, they had an adventure, a sort of adventure, and it brought home to Betsy once for all how much she loved dear, sweet Aunt Frances, and just what kind of love it was. As they crossed the barnyard, the calf approached them playfully, leaping stiff-legged into the air and making a pretense of butting at them with its hornless young head. Betsy and Shep often played with the calf in this way by the half hour, and she thought nothing of it now, hardly noticed it in fact. But Aunt Frances gave a loud, piercing shriek as though she were being cut into pieces. "Help! Help!" she screamed. "Betsy! Oh, Betsy!" She had turned as white as a sheet and could not take a single step forward. It's nothing," said Betsy rather impatiently. "He's just playing. We often play with him, Shep and I." The calf came a little nearer with lowered head. "Get away," said Betsy indifferently, kicking at him. At this hint of masterfulness on Betsy's part, Aunt Frances cried out, "Oh, yes, Betsy, do make him go away. Do make him go away." It came over Betsy that Aunt Frances was really frightened. Yes, really. And all at once her impatience disappeared, never to come back again. She felt toward Aunt Frances just as she did toward little Molly, and she acted accordingly. She stepped in front of Aunt Frances, picked up a stick, and hit the calf a blow on the neck with it. He moved away, startled and injured, looking at his playfellow with reproachful eyes. But Betsy was relentless. Aunt Frances must not be frightened. Here, Shep! Here, Shep!" she called loudly, and when the big dog came bounding to her, she pointed to the calf and said sternly, "Take him to the barn. Drive him into the barn, sir." Shep asked nothing better than this command, and charged forward, barking furiously and leaping into the air as though he intended to eat the calf up alive. The two swept across the barnyard and into the lower reins of the barn. In a moment Shep reappeared, his tongue hanging out, his tail wagging, his eyes glistening, very proud of himself, and mounted guard at the door. Aunt Frances hurried along desperately through the gate of the barnyard. As it fell to behind her, she sank down on a rock, breathless, still pale and agitated. Betsy threw her arms around her in a transport of affection. She felt that she understood Aunt Frances as nobody else could. The dear, sweet, gentle, timid aunt. She took the thin, nervous white fingers in her strong brown hands. "Oh, Aunt Frances, dear darling Aunt Frances," she cried. "How I wish I could always take care of you." The last of the red and gold leaves was slowly drifting to the ground as Betsy and Uncle Henry drove back from the station after seeing Aunt Frances off. They were not silent this time as when they had gone to meet her. They were talking cheerfully together, laying their plans for the winter, which was so near. "I must begin to bank the house tomorrow," mused Uncle Henry, "and those apples have got to go to the cider mill right off. Don't you want to ride over on top of them, Betsy, and see 'em made into cider?" "Oh my, yes," said Betsy. "That will be fine. And I must put away Deborah's summer clothes and get Cousin Ann to help me make some warm ones if I'm going to take her to school in cold weather." As they drove into the yard, they saw Eleanor coming from the direction of the barn with something big and heavy in her mouth. She held her head as high as she could, but even so, her burden dragged on the ground, bumping softly against the rough places on the path. "Look," said Betsy. "Just see that great rat Eleanor has caught." Uncle Henry squinted his old eyes toward the cat for a moment and laughed. "We're not the only ones that are getting ready for winter," he remarked. Betsy did not know what he meant, and climbed hastily over the wheel and ran to see. As she approached Eleanor, the cat laid her burden down with an air of relief and looked trustfully into her little mistress's face. Why, it was one of the kittens. Eleanor was bringing it to the house. Oh, of course. They mustn't stay out there in that cold hayloft now the cold weather was drawing near. Betsy picked up the little sprawling thing, trying with weak legs to get around over the rough ground. She carried it carefully toward the house, Eleanor walking sinuously by its side and talking, and little singing, purring meows to explain her ideas of kitten comfort. Betsy felt that she quite understood her. Yes, Eleanor, a nice little basket behind the stove with a warm piece of an old blanket in it. Yes, I'll fix it for you. It'll be lovely to have the whole family there. And I'll bring the other one in for you. But evidently Eleanor did not understand little girl talk as well as Betsy understood cat talk. For a little later, as Betsy turned from the nest she was making in the corner behind the stove, Eleanor was missing. And when she ran out toward the barn, she met her again, her head strained painfully back, dragging another fat, heavy kitten who curled his pink feet up as high as he could in a vain effort not to have them knocked against the stones. Now, Eleanor, said Betsy, a little put out, you don't trust me enough. I was going to get it all right. Well, said Aunt Abigail as they came into the kitchen, now you must begin to teach them to drink. Goodness, said Betsy, they don't know how to drink already? You try them and see, said Aunt Abigail with a mysterious smile. So when Uncle Henry brought the pails full of fragrant warm milk into the house, Betsy poured out some in a saucer and put the kittens up to it. She and Molly squatted down on their heels to watch, and before long they were laughing so that they were rolling on the kitchen floor. At first the kittens looked every way but at the milk, seeming to see everything but what was under their noses. Then Graykin, that was Betsy's absent-mindedly walked right through the saucer, emerging with very wet feet and a very much aggrieved and astonished expression. Molly screamed with laughter to see him shake his little pink toes and finally sit down seriously to lick them clean, while Whitebib, Molly's, put his head down to the saucer. There, mine is smarter than yours, said Molly, but Whitebib went on putting his head down, clear into the milk, nearly up to his eyes. Although he looked very frightened and miserable, then he jerked it up quickly and sneezed and sneezed and sneezed. Such deliciously fun little baby sneezes. He pawed and pawed at his little pink nose with his little pink paw until Eleanor took pity on him and came to wash him off. In the midst of this process, she saw the milk and left off to lap it up eagerly. And in a jiffy she had drunk every drop and was licking the saucer loudly with her raspy tongue. And that was the end of the kitten's first lesson. That evening, as they sat around the lamp, Eleanor came and got up in Betsy's lap, just like old times. Betsy was playing checkers with Uncle Henry and interrupted the game to welcome the cat back delightedly. But Eleanor was uneasy and kept stopping her toilet to prick up her ears and look restlessly toward the basket, where the kittens lay curled so closely together that they looked like one soft ball of gray fur. By and by, Eleanor jumped down heavily and went back to the basket. She stayed there only a moment, standing over the kittens and licking them convulsively, and then she came back and got up on Betsy's lap again. What ails that cat? Said Cousin Anne, noting this pacing and restlessness. Maybe she wants Betsy to hold her kittens too, suggested Aunt Abigail. Oh, I'd love to, said Betsy, spreading out her knees to make her lap bigger. But I want my own white bib myself, said Molly, looking up from the beads she was stringing. Well, maybe Eleanor will let you settle it that way, said Cousin Nan. The little girls ran over to the basket and brought back each her own kitten. Eleanor watched them anxiously, but as soon as they sat down, she jumped up happily into Betsy's lap and curled down close to little Graykin. This time, she was completely satisfied, and her loud purring filled the room with a peaceable murmur. There, now you're fixed for the winter, said Aunt Abigail. By and by, after Cousin Ann had popped some corn, old Shep got off the couch and came to stand by Betsy's knee to get an occasional handful. Eleanor opened one eye, recognized a friend, and shut it sleepily. But the little kitten woke up in terrible alarm to see that hideous monster so near him, and prepared to sell his life dearly. He bristled up his ridiculous little tail, opened his absurd little pink mouth in a soft baby huss, and struck savagely at old Shep's good-natured face with a soft little paw. Betsy felt her heart overflow with amusement and pride in the intrepid little morsel. She burst into laughter, but she picked it up and held it lovingly close to her cheek. What fun it was going to be to see those kittens grow up. Old Shep padded back softly to the couch, his toenails clicking on the floor, hoisted himself heavily up, and went to sleep. The kitten subsided into a ball again. Eleanor stirred and stretched in her sleep and laid her head in utter trust on her little mistress's hand. After that, Betsy moved the checkers only with her other hand. In the intervals of the game, while Uncle Henry was pondering over his moves, the little girl looked down at her pets and listened absently to the keen autumnal wind that swept around the old house, shaking the shutters and rattling the windows. A stick of wood in the stove burned in two and fell together with a soft, whispering sound. The lamp cast a steady radiance on Uncle Henry, bent seriously over the checkered board. On Molly's blooming, round cheeks and bright hair, on Abigail's rosy, cheerful, wrinkly old face, and on Cousin Ann's quiet, clear, dark eyes. That room was full to the brim of something beautiful, and Betsy knew what it was. Its name was happiness. The end. Good night, baby Alias.